The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and good day to all the ghouls, goblins, and everyone else joining in on this special Halloween webinar. I'm George Wertak, Executive Director of the Consortium for Infectious Disease Control, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's spooktacular webinar. Today's presentation is entitled HPV-based Cervical Screening, Why is Now the Time? This webinar is made possible through the support of Hologic Canada and with the assistance of BD Diagnostics. Now, since today's Halloween, you're in for a real treat, but we will not play any tricks on you. We're fortunate to have a wonderful speaker today who knows a scary lot about screening. I'm referring to Dr. Catherine Popadiuk, who will be introduced shortly. Now, in today's webinar, Dr. Popadiuk will address the learning objectives that you can see on the screen. Our moderator for today's webinar is Dr. Mark Steuban, who, among his other duties, serves as the chair of the Canadian HPV Prevention Network. And I'll pass the microphone over to him in a moment. Now, I always like to remind our audience that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording, as well as the PowerPoint slides, will be made available following the webinar. They'll be archived on CIDC's website, and you can see the address at the bottom of the slide. This recording, along with recordings from other webinars and a number of useful resources, may be found on this website. You can also join the HPV network by completing the contact form online. Now, just to have a few brief housekeeping notes. First, all participants have joined the webinar in listen-only mode. So to ask a question at any time, you can type it in the questions pane and then click the send button. You can hear the audio either via computer speakers or by telephone. If you have sound trouble with the computer speakers, you can select the telephone button, and then the dial-in with the number and code will be displayed. Questions that you submit will be saved, and all or some will be answered following the presentation during the question and answer period at the end of the webinar. If we don't get through all the questions, Dr. Popadiuk has agreed to try to find time to answer at least some of them later in writing, and these will then be posted on the CIDC website. Again, the address is at the bottom. Once again, the webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the slide set will be available on the CIDC website. And finally, we hope that all participants will complete the webinar evaluation. On this slide, you can see the link for the brief evaluation survey. If you registered with your own email address, you will be sent an email following the webinar with the survey link. Otherwise, please take note of the address. Okay, I'd now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Mark Steuban. Dr. Steuban is the chair of the Canadian HPV Prevention Network and a board member of the International Papillomavirus Society. He is an associate professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal and is a medical consultant with the Family Medicine Group 1851 in Montreal. So welcome, Dr. Steuban.
Thank you, George, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to serve as moderator for today's program and to be able to work again with Dr. Popadiuk. I would now like to share a bit of background about today's presenter, Dr. Catherine Popadiuk. She's an associate professor of obstetrics gynecology and gynecological oncology at Memorial University, and has been practicing gynecologic oncology in Newfoundland since 1998. She's been an active member of the research community through many member and leadership roles. She has been a principal investigator for several clinical trials and has a successful translational research finding resulting in a patent. She has been the national lead for the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer OncoSIM model of HPV and cervical cancer since April 2013. Her research interests include the evaluation of cervical screening in young women and innovative strategies to reach disadvantage and underscreen. She is a passionate advocate for women's health and hopes to see the elimination of cervical cancer in her lifetime. So welcome, Dr. Popadiuk.
Thank you so much, Mark and George. It's a pleasure being here, and particularly on this super spooky, important day of Halloween. We were having a bit of trouble getting the slides moving earlier, so hopefully the program can move now. I'm trying to move the slides. I have the privilege of seeing a picture of me for even longer.
Can you click on the slide?
I did, and I have me, and I like me, but enough of me. Perhaps George, you could try to move the slides. Or is Mark still in control of the slides?
Okay, here we go.
So shall I try to control the slides now?
If you could click on the screen and then advance.
So we will be reviewing why we're hoping to have HPV-based cervical cancer screening happen now, sooner than later. And I've tried to move the slide. I have no disclosures to share. As you had heard, I do have a patent. It's commercially not viable, so nothing there. And as you've already seen, we have a number of objectives to get through this morning. I think it's morning in most of the country, or afternoon. And I thought I would start with a bit of background, although I'm sure that everyone on this webinar has experience and interest in cervical cancer. I would expect there is a breadth of that experience and expectations. Unfortunately, as we know, cervical cancer is still a huge problem worldwide, and particularly in the developing countries, with most of the cases still happening in developing countries. In Canada, as our population continues to grow annually, we now have 1,500 new cases of cervical cancer and 400 deaths. Just a few years ago, we used to say there would be 1 death every day. And unfortunately, we still see over a death a day. And I forgot to mention, I want to thank the scientific community who reviewed, or the scientific group who reviewed the slides beforehand, because they gave some excellent feedback to modernize and improve the slides, one of which was for this slide, to remind me that 80% of unvaccinated women will acquire HPV throughout their lifetimes. And actually, probably even more, you can see up to 90%. And I say virtually anyone who's ever had sexual activity is most likely exposed to HPV, of which many are considered oncogenic, but most just go away on their own and don't cause any problems for patients. I put this schematic up, this picture, more to show us about the natural history of HPV towards precancer dysplasia and cancer, and to remind us that HPV usually goes away, most of it regresses, but 20% can go to a minor lesion, and of that 20%, 5 to 10% can go to a more significant lesion, but there is regression, and unfortunately 30% in 3 can go on to squamous cell cancer or invasive adenocarcinoma, and that's over 30 years. And we learned that from an unfortunate trial in New Zealand several decades ago. So that's very troubling. And note that if you go to cancer, there is no regression back from cancer, unfortunately. I put this diagram up more to share about the timelines for going from an HPV infection, and if you're unable to clear it within a year or 2, having a problem with a persistent infection that over many years can go on to precancer of mild or moderate severe type, and eventually to invasive cancer. So this can happen over 2 to 5 years, 4 to 5 years, and up to 15 years. This just highlights the timelines between screening, that we have an opportunity to catch precancer and do something about it. I put this slide up just to show us the life cycle of HPV within squamous epithelium, such as on the cervix, and a normal HPV, arguably a normal HPV infection that goes away goes through a whole life cycle of creating new little HPVs, and it expresses its DNA, which starts with E6, E7, and then E4, creates viral DNA, and finishes the life cycle, and little HPVs are spewed out and go away. But some women and men, depending on what their mucosa is, are unable to eradicate the HPV. It doesn't form its full life cycle and spew off little HPV virions. It sits in the DNA, and we see E6 and E7 sitting in the DNA, not going away through the full life cycle, and this is where we have SIN3. And I share this slide because we're using this information with this messenger RNA of E6 and E7 to inform us on possible screening strategies. This is an ancient slide, and I think everyone participating has probably an idea of who Dr. Popadiuk was, and he discovered cytology as a method of identifying abnormalities on the cervix. And note the date, that this was 1923 when this modern innovative technology occurred. And again, most people are aware of pap smears, and you're wondering, why did I even put this slide up? And it's to share that this is an old standard pap smear. It's called a conventional pap smear. And I would think many people on this webinar are thinking, well, I haven't seen one of those in forever. But in BC, they're still doing dry pap smears and air drying. And there are many locations in Canada where conventional cytology is still done, as opposed to liquid-based cytology, which is more recent, and which also allows an opportunity to have HPV testing associated with the liquid form. So that's why I put that there, because we sort of assume that we have the most state-of-the-art cytology screening in the country, but that is not the case in many places, in Canada at least. And just a brief review about HPV. There are many, many HPV types, oncogenic and non-oncogenic, and probably well over 170 types presently. We know that 16 and 18 are the big actors contributing to cervical cancer, accounting for approximately 70%, depending on geographic location. There are, and is quoted frequently, there are 4 major FDA-approved HPV assays, and I've listed them there from a reference. In Canada, we also have several Health Canada approved HPV type of assays, and again, I have listed a number of them. This was a question among our scientific reviewers, and I was very fortunate to get more information from my colleague, Dr. Ratnam, who is unable to participate in the webinar today. But he had shared that actually there are 190 commercial assays. That is a typo on my part. And the tests on the market are based on unique molecular principles with advantages and limitations. But the test kit name is connected to manufacturer. And it's always good to use manufacturers' names because sometimes the kits are marketed and licensed under different trade names. There was a question like, how could there be so many commercial assays, 190? And of course, that varies by country and by the marketing of the products. Presently, for the most part, HPV testing is done primarily, not quite, and originally as reflex tests for ASCUS triage. And of course, the Digene test, QIAGEN, is the gold standard that has been around the longest. This is a schematic about how the Digene test or the QIAGEN test works. And it's a combination of breaking down the DNA and matching it with RNA, and then using various antibodies as a parameter of measurement until at the end, the antibodies are washed away and you get a chemiluminescence type of reading, and people who've done HPV testing with the QIAGEN product for years will remember you get a relative light unit reading, and that's the chemiluminescence. Now that is a bit different from the DNA type of testing. That was a signal amplification, and the DNA testing tends to be done with polymerase chain reactions, and this is a diagram of how that's done. And basically the DNA strand of what you're measuring is broken into 2 pieces, and the probes for the various HPV types, these little pink things, if that HPV is present in the sample, it matches it, and then they add little nucleotides, remember the C's and the T's and so on, and make them grow, and then they divide again with these little probes, and then you measure how much is present. And so that's how the DNA type of PCR is done. And so those are the variation of the HPV tests that are presently available. Now, a few of the studies that have been done over the last number of years, and I should say I did not include our Canadian CCAS study, but that was quite foundational again, and thanks to Dr. Ratnam and our colleagues in Montreal who published in the New England Journal about how sensitive HPV testing is for screening of cervical cancer and precancer, and that was many, many years ago. The Athena study I put up as an example. That was done in the United States, and this clinical trial actually was the reason that primary HPV testing with the Cobas DNA product was approved for primary HPV testing in the United States. I put this trial up to share that what was really interesting about it and why the sensitivities seem to be a bit lower in that trial than others is because they actually incorporated a verification bias in their trial. So at the outset, patients were identified up front before all the testing into having colposcopy, even if they were negative for HPV test and cytology. So double negative. And when you do colposcopy of people that you think are completely normal, you actually might find some SIN2 pluses. And that's why that's an example of verification bias that they corrected on their trial, which isn't necessarily in other trials, and I found that very interesting. Just something to keep in mind a few slides forward. And I think many people should be acquainted with the Ronco meta-analysis that was published in 2013 of 4 large European randomized controlled trials for HPV testing versus standard cytology, and this is what was from Sweden, the Popadiuk study, Artistic, and NTCC. And you can see the ages, whether it was conventional cytology for most of them or liquid-based cytology. And in the end, they found when they did the meta-analysis of these 4 very powerful randomized control trials that HPV-based cervical screening for women at 30 at intervals of 5 years was superior and more sensitive and gave an excellent negative predictive value and was better than cytology. So that too added tremendous import and information showing that HPV testing is very sensitive and effective and very helpful to detect adenocarcinomatous lesions or adenocarcinoma in situ, which cytology we know has had problems in accessing and detecting. And this is the slide that is associated with the Ronco data and clearly shows that there are more cancers in the cytology arm every 3 years than with the HPV arm, where if you're negative, you're less likely to encounter a problem in 6 years. We also in Canada have more recently had the focal trial results published in JAMA, which again showed that HPV testing was superior and better at baseline. Women were significantly less likely to have SIN3 and SIN2 plus at 48 months compared with women who were cytology negative. So that was very, very helpful to finally get published. And as well, as a little caveat and side trial, when the focal trial was organized, they did not only the QIAGEN HPV test, which you recall was the signal amplification and the gold standard, they also did the Aptima test, which looks at E6 and E7 messenger RNA. And if you recall the schematic, by the time you have E6 and E7 throughout the squamous mucosa, you're actually well established into dysplasia. So they were wondering if using that test would have the same negative predictive value and sensitivity, and that was a sort of safeguard test, and they indeed did find that the Aptima test worked as well within significance of the QIAGEN test. And this is just a table if anyone wants to dissect it. I won't be dissecting it within our short webinar, but it shows how they ran the trial and shows that virtually they are the same for their outcomes. And here, this was a German trial, again, looking at the safety of an RNA-based Aptima HPV test compared to the gold standard of a DNA-based hybrid captured 2 QIAGEN test with a screening interval of 6 years, which we tend not to see as much in North America. And in their study, they had over 10,000 women. They did liquid-based cytology, hybrid captured 2, and the Aptima test. And of those, 411 women tested positive on at least one test. 3,200 plus women were triple negative for all those tests. And the data showed that longitudinal performance of the Aptima over 6 years is comparable to the performance of the hybrid capture 2, with the absolute risk of SYN3 plus over 6 years. Very, very good. And this is just a table going into the positives and negatives of hybrid capture 2 versus the Aptima test, the liquid-based results, the negatives, low grades, high grades, and ultimately here we have a hybrid capture 2 that was positive and Aptima that was negative, and there was only one. And where both are positive, they're more likely to be positive. But that's all within an appropriate error and significance. And here is just an idea of the incidence, cumulative incidence of SYN2 or worse or SYN3 or worse of the test. Liquid-based cytology performs the worst, and hybrid capture 2 and Aptima perform much, much better. The risk per 1,000 women screened is always easier to understand for us. So for SYN3 plus, 9.3 per 1,000 women would develop SYN3 plus if they were liquid-based negative, but only 2.2 and 3.1 per 1,000 if we used the HPV type of testing, be it Aptima or the QIAGEN test. So these are very, very persuasive and reassuring results. The time from enrollment up to 6 years, and you see hybrid capture 2 and the Aptima test both performing very, very well and superior to cytology. So that is very, very helpful. Now here, I put this old slide up because I think it's helpful just for reminding us that here we have a normal Ap test, but you can still have SYN2s and 3s and ascus. Most ascus are normal, but then you are expecting a few more abnormal cells. And if you have an L cell, still many PAPs are normal. And that's the problem. And it gets messy for the sensitivities and specificities depending on what you're measuring. And it's hardest for the care provider who has to deal with the patients. So having a more sensitive test and higher confidence helps us. And that's where DNA testing comes in. I'm not going to go through the next two tables in detail. These came from the CADITH Health Technology Assessment that was done to evaluate HPV testing versus cytology for screening of cervical precancer and cancer, and they list the hybrid capture 2 test, cytology, LBC, the sensitivities and the specificities, and you'll see repetitively for SYN2 plus, and then in the next slide for SYN3 plus, that the sensitivity is much better with HPV to detect abnormalities versus PAPs at a level of ascus or ELSA. And move to the next slide. I put this slide in again, going back to the verification bias issue in the right paper, the positivity, the sensitivity with liquid-based cytology in the right paper is much less than we would usually expect for cytology, which can go 50, 60, 70%. And of course, the Aptima and the COBUS test, much, much more robust for SYN3. A word about self-sampling. It is critical that we are able to reach women who are unable to participate in screening for whatever reason. And one of the ways of doing it to address those women is to offer them self-sampling. And here are a few examples of various self-sampling tools available. The HerSwab tube tool was available in Canada. And on a meta-analysis and review previously with CADITH, they found that for self-sampled HPV tests, they were similarly sensitive and specific to clinician sampled tests, which is reassuring because you're always worried you're not taking the sample properly. But they noticed that for whatever reason, the signal amplification test, the standard QIAGEN, was less sensitive and less specific with self-sampled specimens than with clinician-sampled specimens. And that was a little bit worrisome. But in December of 2018, just not a year ago, a new meta-analysis came up by Arbin. And what they found was, and this helped explain it, that tests performed on self-samples are similarly sensitive and slightly less specific than tests performed on clinician samples when using HPV assay-based tests on polymerase chain reactions. So more of those DNA tests as opposed to signal amplification. And that's a technology issue that was identified. And of course, offering self-sampling, women do tend to participate better in screening. So that was something of interest. And here is just a summary of the signal amplification test having lesser sensitivity than a PCR type DNA test. So that's something to keep in mind if one wants to offer screening by self-sampling. Now, what does this impact on the system? This table comes from the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer Environmental Scan, and they asked the provinces, so what are you doing with HPV DNA testing in Canada? And it's not just the, HPV DNA testing, it's signal amplification, it's E6, E7. It was just a broad question, and basically we're not doing very well in Canada. The provinces barely offer any funded HPV testing of any type and highly variable, and no one has established primary HPV testing yet, despite the strongest of efforts from Ontario and BC to do so. This is a slide that I'll go through quickly where the new OncoSim model, which was called the Cancer Risk Management Model, took all of these factors, used the model, and came out to some costs and expectations about if you change screening, how much more testing, colposcopy will be required, how much more costly will it be. And the base case was cytology every 3 years from 25, and then they actually measure the increase in incidence and deaths, colposcopies and screens. And I put this slide more for illustration to show you that HPV testing every 5 years is very, very helpful and does, in the big picture, eventually in a number of decades come out with less colposcopies. And that includes women who've started being vaccinated. This is another schematic of the same sort of looking at HPV testing. This was called ASCO versus the Canadian Task Force. HPV testing every 5 years versus every 3 years for PAPS. We have participant screening rates, colposcopy costs, and so on, and the vaccine that was available with our assumptions. And basically by 2036, based on what we're doing now with vaccination at about 60% in some places and no HPV testing yet, we're not going to see a significant change in deaths or cases. We will see that you will do less colposcopies in a vaccinated population than in not vaccinated, and less colposcopies with HPV testing than with cytology, which people seem to think is the opposite, but it's the opposite in the short term. And the costs here are pretty similar. With vaccination, the costs are higher, but the vaccination costs there were at the full $450, not what would be expected in high volume settings. So in total, any modeling in Canada says that over the next 20 years, incidence and mortality are projected to be similar if we do things as we're doing, but colposcopy usage and costs would be great using cytology for both vaccinated and non-vaccinated. And in the vaccinated setting, these differences are more pronounced. And I put this here. It's a really confusing slide. I will speak to it quickly. The modelers in Australia, who are phenomenal, looked at how many PAPs or tests are you going to need in your lifetime, depending on when you start and when you finish. And it's like 26 in Australia when they screened every 2 years. But if you change to HPV-based screening, it goes down to 10. and in England from 12 to 7 or 8, 18 to 9. So by going to HPV testing, the number of screens will be less. This is a horribly busy slide. But what they're trying to say is if you're looking at the incidence of getting cancer today, it's here, versus if you've been vaccinated, it would go down. This is the bivalent or quadrivalent vaccine. That's the expectation of getting cancer in that population. And trying to assess how many screens you need. Again, I'm not going to go through the details. That as the vaccinated population goes through, you're not going to need very many screens to have the risk of what we have for cancer today, which is arguably still too high a risk. But in Canada, North America, it's a small risk. And to maintain that small risk with HPV testing in a vaccinated cohort, you only need 1 screen in Australia, or 2 per lifetime to be cost effective. There was also cost effectiveness here. So I share this as an interesting paper, but the bottom line from it is that with the vaccinated cohort and HPV testing available to us, as there is less expectation of lesions, women are not going to need to be screened as often, and that's a really interesting concept. So the WHO has put out that there is a commitment now to eliminate cervical cancer and to do it by 2030. So some targets to think about here, hopefully in Canada, we'd like to promote the rapid transition and implementation to primary HPV testing for cervical cancer screening. It is critical to continue to advance the importance of vaccination for boys and girls alike, and from children to men and women who could have the vaccines, and education and creating culturally appropriate strategies to access everyone who needs to benefit from screening is critical to do. But logistically, if you can go back and remember that table from the CPAC environmental scan of where the provinces are today, we haven't even got ASCUS triage in every province. There isn't a universal test of cure to help triage patients out of colposcopy in most provinces. There's certainly no primary HPV testing in Canada yet, and the WHO elimination of cervical cancer by 2030 would like to see 90% of women vaccinated, 70% screened with HPV. In Canada, we're aiming for 90%. And then, of course, of those women who are screening positive, to make sure 90% have appropriate treatment. What is really critical now, and it's a watershed time, especially it's 2019, it's almost 2020. 2030 is a decade away. Communication is so critical. Yesterday, I heard a radio interview on Radio 1 Ontario with Dr. Jennifer Blake of the SOGC speaking about the elimination of cervical cancer with women for an hour. And I was amazed at how the women who brought their issues forward about frequency of screening, their perceptions, experiences, cancers, the information they shared was actually not accurate. So we have so much to do to educate women and care providers alike, and systems, the labs and the downstream effects. It is very, very hard. I will share with you, Australia is poised to become the first country to eliminate cervical cancer and well by 2030. And they did communication, education for years about moving to primary HPV testing. This was in 2015, getting them ready for 2017. Tons of actual effort and investment to do so. And even when they did it, it went badly. The country just was not ready, and they had everything ready. So it's a lesson about how difficult this is to actually mobilize and move inertia to create change. And remember, it was 1929 when Dr. Popadiuk created cytology. It's going to be 100 years before 2030. And then these are the things that were out in the media: delays and confusion, cloud rollout of new cervical cancer screening program in Australia. And the next slide, there was actually a petition where women said they didn't feel that they were informed enough. They wanted to have more information. And there was, we would think, a great deal of information, but it just shows how hard it is to permeate people's consciousness at every level, every demographic of women. And they, for whatever reason, it did not go well. The number one problem that I understood happened in Australia was that women were most uncomfortable of moving from a 2-year interval for screening to 5 years with an HPV test. And I expect that that will be a huge barrier here in Canada, as I heard. This is the most recent publication I found from CIDC. Remember those tables that I shared earlier about sensitivity, specificities in their technology review? And the draft report of that technology review said, you know what, HPV testing looks pretty good, but Canada's just not ready for it yet. You know, mobilizing so much change, the labs won't be ready, operationally it'll be too hard. And the bottom line here, they didn't say we wouldn't be ready for 10 years as the original draft was written. They said a switch to HPV testing would be a large operational and cultural shift for clinicians, patients, and labs. Of course, successful implementation would require appropriate planning, funding, and coordination. And they speak to all the positive things about HPV testing, caution about colposcopy originally, and so on. But that is arguably our biggest barrier. So HPV-based cervical cancer screening, now is the time. We are technically 11 years away, but a decade away. It'll be 100 years since Dr. Popadiuk. We cannot let technical operational obstacles circumvent our efforts. Canada has been a world leader for cervical cancer screening. BC cytology was first in the world, and we are known as leaders for cervical cancer screening. Unfortunately, right now, we appear to be losing that momentum and have been sort of stuck in inertia. So a last word, again, from the scientific committee to help remind me that HPV vaccination does help not only cervix cancer eradication, but other cancers. And Ian Fraser is our new Papa Nicolau as our hero. Here he's written up as God's gift to women, but the HPV vaccine is a gift for all, and men and women are affected by anal and oropharyngeal cancer. That is a snapshot of Michael Douglas when he gave a benefit event at McGill a few years ago, and I bolted right down there and managed to get in for the 10 minutes of photo ops. So that is my photo, and I own it, so I can share that. And again, HPV affects men with penile cancers and women for their vulvar and vaginal cancers. So that is really exciting for the future. And thank you so much for listening to my whirlwind tour on Halloween through HPV primary testing and elements that will impact on HPV elimination over the next number of years. Thank you so much for your attention, particularly today as it is Halloween and everyone's getting very busy for the trick-or-treaters coming out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Popadiuk, for providing a very comprehensive overview of cervical screening and some of the advantages of HPV-based testing. So we'll look if our audience has any question, please type them in the question box and send them in. We will now move on to the question and answer period. So there's a question about why screen, why not just vaccinate?
Oh, it sounds so good, especially as I shared the Australian modeling there. Well, even if we vaccinate with the quadrivalent vaccine, which has 7 types of high-risk HPV, that will help eliminate 90% of antigenic HPV-causing strains towards cervical cancer. It still means that there is going to be cervical cancer out there. 10% we're not going to be able to vaccinate against. And that is still extremely significant. So we're going to have to figure out what to do about those few cancers that might be left over. And then it comes into evaluating Will cervical cancer be a disease that will happen frequently enough to even offer a screening test? Because that's one of the criteria to offer a screening test. You have a test available, the disease is of interest, you can do something before it becomes a problem. But sort of like some rare cancers, it'll be seen how uncommon and rare cervical cancer might become. Based on all of the information we have today, there still seems to be a benefit of offering screening once or twice in a woman's lifetime to detect some leftover HPV. So that's kind of where we are today. Maybe in 20 years, we'll get more information, find out there might be some cross protection offered that we weren't aware of in the nonavalent vaccine, and indeed we're covering more than we expect of the HPV types. It's over 90%. And yes, maybe it'll be a disease that I hope never to see, like that it's just going to be so rare that we won't need to have a screening test available. Something to look forward to.
What's the cost of screening with HPV testing compared to cytology?
It depends if the cytology is a conventional cytology, the dry pap smear, or if it's liquid-based cytology. The liquid-based cytology is a bit more expensive, and it also depends on the operational components of the test, the experience required. With cytology, we'll require a cytotech to read the test, so those are resources involved. With HPV testing, there's more of a technical component and reagents. The full price of an HPV test, as I'm acquainted to, is about $86 to $100, and that varies also with the various tests. That's if someone buys a test not available to them. I would not be able to tell you for certain in large population-based programs what the buyers got the prices for. You would expect in a tendering process, if a population asks for something, you'll be able to bring the price down by volume. But it is thought that HPV testing is more expensive now than cytology per test. In cytology, they would quote as something like $25 to $35, again, depending if you include tray fees and other costs.
There's a question about the control. What do you say about internal cellular control to assure that the sampling was well done, especially for auto-sampling patients to avoid false positive results?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the latter part that you shared, Mark. Can you repeat the question?
It's someone is asking, what do you say about internal cellular control to assure that the sampling was well done?
What I have read, because in there's quality assurance with the protocols, and that is done by the labs, and if the sample is not satisfactory, which is not too common, they will report an unsatisfactory result. So that is reassuring that there is QA at the level of the lab. For you internally, I don't think there's more to be able to do than to try to do as best a sample as you can to get something on the sample floating through the liquid base or on a slide or so on. That being said, in the focal trial, they did do an internal control where they used like a beta globulin to assess the DNA content. But individually, I don't think there is more that one can do to assure a good sampling by yourself.
Would there be place for auto-sampling for patients in Canada? We can understand for developing countries.
Oh, you mean like doing your self-sampling?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. The self-sampling, we've just finished our study in Newfoundland, and there have been a few studies in Aboriginal communities, Thunder Bay. British Columbia is doing a study in Aboriginal communities in northern BC. I do think that there is a place for self-sampling to access under-screened and under-reached women. We Preliminarily, we're preparing our results. We had a good uptake in the self-sampling. We sent out letters reminding women to participate in screening and also sent self-sampling kits. And I think we had at least double more in the self-sampling arm than we did in the male reminder arm. I do think that there is a role for self-sampling, and it will be part of programmatic provincial screening programs, but it's a cautionary note that before we kind of recognize that the DNA PCR type tests seem to perform better for whatever reason than the antibody-based signal amplification QIAGEN test, there was this uncertainty as to why it seemed like the sensitivity specificity didn't seem to work. And when they teased out that for whatever reason here for self-sampling the technology might impact, it just would suggest that for self-sampling programs would have to consider perhaps using a DNA PCR-based test to have greater confidence. But I found the meta-analysis very reassuring. With our own trial here in Newfoundland, it was remarkable some of the feedback on questionnaires. Even professional women who worked in healthcare wrote back and said, oh, you know, like, did I do it right? How do I know that I actually got to the cervix, or I took a good sample, or there's still that uncertainty about it. So I think a lot of education has to be done for the patients or the women who choose to participate, but it should be part of screening programs.
We have a comment. It is not true that most new cases of cervical cancers are from patients that have not been screened regularly or screened at all. Why not put the emphasis on creating programs that get more women tested firstly before we change from pap smears?
And that is an excellent, excellent comment. Our biggest problem is that women don't get screened, and of invasive cervical cancer cases that are diagnosed, certainly the larger ones, are in women who have not been screened in over 5 years, 10 years, or ever. And that is the problem. It's a balance, and I think that has been some of the inertia that the programs, all the infrastructure supports, and traditionally, and I'm a believer of this, if cytology testing was done well, and all women who should have had pap tests done had them done every 3 years, then the incidence of cervical cancer in Canada should have been much, much less. But, you know, up to half women don't have regular screening or at intervals that they're supposed to, and that's where we get a significant proportion of our cancers. And so that has created this problem, and we certainly know, even with that we're not reaching women. And even if we had perfect cytology screening every 3 years, the pap test does not get access to those adenocarcinomas as well. And so even with perfect cytology screening of 100% of women, as they should be, we will eliminate the squamous cell cancers very effectively, but that will be a problem. There will still be a problem with adenocarcinomas. So we have new technology available now that is better able to address the adenocarcinomas, regardless of what one feels about when to change. And unfortunately, change is happening so much quicker than before. We certainly know that every day in our lives with the IT and electronic records and the cloud and the internet. You know, within a year, the iPhone has changed the world. We can either keep trying to fix something that since about the 1950s we haven't been able to fix, or we can choose to also move forward and adapt new technology that we know will address the problem that even if we fixed the old problems and had perfect cytology, wouldn't fix the adenocarcinoma problem. So that's my token comment.
There's a question. What are your thoughts about the Netherlands model? Do you think screening every 5 to 10 years is adequate?
In the Netherlands, their screening has been less frequent. that population seems to be more comfortable that women will be diagnosed with early stage cervical cancers as opposed to the precancers where we would do more leaps. And that is a population type of choice. I don't think that that would go well. That is not, the risk level there in the Netherlands would not be seen as acceptable in Canada or North America. And again, listening to the comments from women on the Radio 1 piece, Ontario, moving from 1-year screening interval to 3-year screening intervals has been poorly received. So absolutely, our population would not tolerate such a large interval and the added risk of having small cancers develop in that time.
We have a question about, has anyone looked in the potential impact of HPV primary on detection of glandular malignancies? There are several endometrial cancers detected on PAPs as incidental finding.
And that is an excellent point, and something that I have been reviewing personally with our lab. And that's the question of, what value does co-testing offer? And for cervical cancer, co-testing being doing a PAP test and an HPV test at the same time and interpreting both results at the same time. For impacting on cervical cancer, it adds very little benefit to a primary HPV test to add the cytology. But the fringe benefit, I'll call that of finding endometrial cells serendipitously on a PAP, that is something that primary HPV testing would not do. So it comes to, as we consider how to incorporate new technology that we feel is better, without limiting the benefits of the old technology, and being Canadian, we're good at compromise and finding solutions. I suspect that that there might be a role for cytology in women over 40, or women who've had irregular periods and so on, where you see these endometrial cells and you pick up these endometrial cancers. And going back to my lab, as we have talked about rollout and move our program forward, we struggle with changing immediately to HPV testing. And we're all impacted by our anecdotes. I've showed you a number of tables that I'm hoping you can go back to and dissect in your own personal time. But there are those one patients in those thousands of women who had an HPV negative test and had a SIM3+. And for a population, that's not significant. But if it's your patient, you're asked, well, how did that happen? This isn't supposed to happen. And that anchors you into this discomfort. And in my lab, we have evaluated different HPV tests, and some work have more positives one way, others have positives another way, as we've seen. And we struggle with that. So we were thinking that as we roll out and try to approach primary HPV testing, we would actually feel more comfortable about doing cytology and HPV over a transition period, which would allow the care providers to get used to things, the participants, the women to get used to things, the increasing interval. But one would argue against this and say, well, this is really, really costly. Well, you have to make investments before you get your significant returns. And for us, this is something that we're contemplating doing. Because, by 2030, the WHO thinks we're going to eliminate cervical cancer and have primary HPV testing. And in Canada, we have these concerns, these discomforts about changing. And so that's one solution we have.
We have a comment, just wondering why HPV testing would be such a challenge when the use of the broom will be the same tool for specimen collection.
The challenge has been that, I'll give an example, this is not an accurate reflection, that right now you'll do 1,000 cytology tests, and those cytology tests will be read by certain cytotechnology technicians. If you move to HPV testing, you'll have 1,000 HPV tests from that same liquid, and they will go to a machine where a different technician will put them in the machine and then spew out results. And those cytotechnologists won't be there. And then you'll do less cytology based on the HPV test, depending on your algorithm for what you do. If you're HPV negative, we feel comfortable you can have another HPV test in 5 years, or maybe less, comfort of the population. If you're HPV positive, then you might get a cytology test. But it's at most, if you do HPV testing in young women because they're starting to have sexual activity and it's far more frequent, 10% of women might test HPV positive. If you stick to a vaccinated cohort of women or older women where you're not expecting to have that HPV, 5% might be positive. So it's going to impact on manpower and workforces and the labs, pathology labs. And that's huge because we've been doing that since the 50s, since 1929 when Dr. Popadiuk looked at cells on a slide. That is a huge, huge paradigm shift, and you can imagine how uncomfortable people are. It's been a huge workforce problem. In Newfoundland, our technicians do both, so if we change, it won't be a problem for them. But in most of Canada, this will impact on people's jobs.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. I would like to thank Dr. Popadiuk for an excellent presentation and discussion around the questions from our audience. It has been a pleasure working with you on this educational webinar, and I will now pass the microphone over to George Flo for closing comments.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Steban. I would also like to thank Dr. Popadiuk for a very interesting presentation. And of course, thank you, Dr. Steban, for once again supporting CIDC's continuing medical education series. Now, CIDC very much appreciates the support of Hologic Canada that allowed us to bring this webinar to you at no cost. And I'd like to thank BD Diagnostics for their assistance. Please remember to complete the evaluation by clicking on the link in the follow-up email that you'll receive shortly. Note that this webinar has been recorded, and the video recording and the slide set will be available on CIDC's website soon. You can see the address on the screen. You can find these and other resources on that website. Also, please note that the next webinar in CIDC's Continuing Medical Education series will be provided on Tuesday, November 12th at 12 noon Eastern Time. And the title of that webinar is Accelerating Cervical Cancer Elimination, What You Can Do. You can register for this webinar on the CIDC website or watch for an email notice. Thanks again for your interest in CIDC webinars. We look forward to connecting with you again on November 12th. And until then, enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your Halloween evening. Goodbye now.